Sometimes the deepest desperation leads to the most extraordinary discoveries. When you've lost everything and people call you a fool, sometimes that's exactly when life decides to surprise you. Elias Hartwell was at rock bottom when he spent his last $300 on a rotting boat that hadn't touched water in 20 years. Everyone in Cedar Bay thought he'd lost his mind. The rusted Morning Star sat behind Murphy's boatyard like a graveyard of broken dreams. But Elias saw something others missed, strange markings carved into the metal. When he found a hidden compartment containing an old journal and sea charts, he discovered the boat held secrets worth more than anyone imagined. The journal spoke of a shipwreck and a fortune of $127 million lost beneath the waves. Now this humble fisherman faced an impossible choice that would change everything. What would you do if you discovered a treasure that could save your town but came with a dying man's final request? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt-stained air of Cedar Bay carried more than the scent of the sea, it carried stories. Stories of fishermen who'd made their fortunes and lost them to a single storm. Stories of boats that had sailed out proud and returned as driftwood. Stories of families who'd watched the horizon for men who would never come home. Elias Hartwell knew all these stories by heart because his own family had lived every one of them. At 58, Elias possessed the weathered hands and sun-creased face that marked a lifetime spent working the waters off the Maine coast. His shoulders, though still broad, carried a stoop that hadn't been there 5 years ago, before the medical bills, before the funeral, before the slow, grinding poverty that had worn him down like waves against granite. The compass his father had given him, a brass instrument that had guided 3 generations of Hartwell men through fog and storm, now sat on his kitchen table next to a stack of past-due notices. The compass still worked perfectly. It was everything else that had gone wrong. Cedar Bay wasn't the kind of place that attracted tourists or developers. The harbor was too shallow for the big boats, too rocky for pleasure craft, and too honest for anyone looking to make easy money. 300 souls called it home, most of them connected by blood, marriage, or the shared understanding that comes from trusting your life to the same treacherous waters every day. The town consisted of a main street that ran 2 blocks from Murphy's boatyard to St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church, with everything important, the post office, Della's Diner, and the Fisherman's Credit Union, squeezed in between. Elias lived in a small house on Anchor Street, 2 blocks up from the water, in a cottage that had belonged to his grandfather. The white paint was peeling, the front steps sagged, and the heating bill had become a monthly source of anxiety. But from the kitchen window, he could see the harbor, and that view had been worth more to him than money, until money became the thing standing between him and keeping the house at all. His brother Marcus lived in a tidy ranch house on the other side of town, close enough to walk to in 10 minutes, but far enough to feel like a different world. Marcus had made different choices, married his high school sweetheart, worked his way up to supervisor at the paper mill in Millbrook, saved his money, planned for the future. At 55, Marcus Hartwell was everything his older brother wasn't. Practical, successful, and increasingly impatient with Elias's what he called romantic notions about the sea. The ocean doesn't owe you anything, Marcus had said just last week, standing in Elias's kitchen while his brother sorted through bills. Dad's compass isn't going to pay the electric company, and neither is stubbornness. The conversation had ended badly, like most of their conversations these days. Marcus couldn't understand why Elias didn't just sell the house, move to Millbrook, maybe find work at the mill. Elias couldn't explain that leaving Cedar Bay would be like cutting out his own heart. Some things couldn't be reduced to dollars and cents, though Marcus had never seen it that way. The trouble had started 3 years ago when Elias's wife, Maria, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The insurance had covered some of the treatment, but experimental therapies and trips to specialists in Boston had drained their savings, then their credit, then everything else. Maria had fought for 18 months with the kind of quiet courage that had made Elias love her even more deeply, if such a thing was possible. When she died on a Tuesday morning in February, she'd left him with memories that sustained him and debts that were slowly drowning him. His fishing boat, the Sarah's Dream, named for their daughter who lived in California and called every Sunday but couldn't afford to visit, had been sold 6 months ago to cover the most pressing medical bills. Without a boat, Elias had been reduced to working as crew for other fishermen, taking whatever jobs he could find. The pay was decent when the fish were running, but winter had been long and spring had been slow, and the past due notices were multiplying faster than he could address them. That's how he'd ended up at Murphy's boatyard on a grey April morning, looking for work and finding instead the boat that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Tom Murphy was 72 and had been building and repairing boats since before Elias was born. His yard sat on 3 acres of rocky ground overlooking the harbour, filled with vessels in various states of construction, repair, or abandonment. Murphy knew every boat in Cedar Bay by name and could tell you stories about most of them that would make you laugh or cry, depending on his mood and your tolerance for the truth. "Nothing today, Elias," Murphy had said without looking up from the engine he was rebuilding. "Dave Morrison's got all the crew he needs for his boat, and the Peterson boys are still hauling with family only." Elias had nodded and was turning to leave when he saw her. The Morning Star sat in the far corner of the yard, her hull resting on wooden blocks like a beached whale. She was a 36-foot fishing vessel, built sometime in the 1940s, with lines that spoke of an era when boats were crafted by men who understood that beauty and function weren't mutually exclusive. But years of neglect had taken their toll. Her white paint had faded to the color of old bones, her deck was warped and stained, and rust bloomed along her waterline like some exotic disease. Most people saw only the decay. Elias saw the bones of something magnificent. "How long has she been sitting there?" he'd asked Murphy, who followed his gaze and shook his head. "The Morning Star. Hell, must be 20 years now, maybe more. Old Henrik Larsen owned her. Used to take her out for lobster. When he died, the family couldn't afford to maintain her, couldn't find a buyer either. Been trying to get someone to haul her away for scrap, but nobody wants to pay for the work." Elias walked over to the boat, running his hand along her hull. The metal was solid beneath the rust, the construction sound despite the cosmetic damage. Her engine compartment was accessible, her wheelhouse intact. Under all the neglect, she was still a boat that could be made seaworthy again. "What would you take for her?" Elias had asked. Murphy laughed, then saw that Elias was serious. "You can't be thinking of buying that old girl. She'd need everything: new engine, new electronics, hull work, deck replacement. You're looking at $20,000 minimum, probably more. What would you take for her as she sits?" Murphy studied him for a long moment. "Elias, you can't afford to get into a project like this. Not now. Just tell me the price." The old man sighed. $300, and that's just to get her off my property. "But son, this is not the boat for you, not in your situation." But Elias was already seeing past the rust and rot. He was seeing the Morning Star, as she could be, as she had been. His father's compass seemed to warm in his pocket, pointing him towards something he couldn't yet name. That afternoon, he'd returned with the $300 money he'd scraped together from the coffee can under his kitchen sink, the emergency fund that was supposed to last until his next job. Murphy had shaken his head and made Elias sign a paper absolving him of any responsibility for what he called this fool purchase. The news had spread through Cedar Bay by evening. At Della's Diner, where the town's unofficial council of elders gathered each morning for coffee and judgment, the consensus was unanimous. Elias Hartwell had finally lost his mind. "Poor man's been through too much," said Mrs. Kowalski, who had taught half the town in her 40 years at Cedar Bay Elementary. "Grief makes people do strange things." Father Miguel Santana, who had officiated at Maria's funeral and had been gently checking on Elias ever since, was more diplomatic. "Perhaps he sees something we don't," the priest had suggested, though even he looked concerned when he stopped by Elias's house that evening. "I'm not having a breakdown," Elias had assured him, serving coffee in Maria's good cups. "I know how it looks, but there's something about that boat, something worth saving." Sarah Chen, the town's librarian and unofficial historian, had been the only person to offer practical support. At 34, she was one of the few people under 50 who had chosen to stay in Cedar Bay, drawn by the town's history and the peace that came from living somewhere the rest of the world had largely forgotten. She had moved to Maine from Seattle 5 years ago, seeking a different kind of life, and had fallen in love with the stories embedded in every weathered building and rusted mooring. "If you need help researching the boat's history," she'd told Elias, "the library has records going back to the 1800s. Sometimes knowing where something came from helps you understand where it's meant to go." Marcus, predictably, had been less supportive. $300, he'd said when he'd heard. $300 you didn't have to spend on a boat that hasn't floated in 20 years. "Elias, what the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking that sometimes you have to take a chance." "This isn't a chance, it's charity. Tom Murphy just took the last of your money for his junk pile." They'd argued until Marcus left, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Elias had stood in his empty kitchen afterward, holding his father's compass, wondering if everyone else was right. Maybe grief had clouded his judgment. Maybe the boat was just a romantic gesture that would bankrupt him completely. But the next morning, when he'd walked to Murphy's yard and seen the morning star in the early light, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the desperate hope of a man clinging to wreckage, but the steady hope of someone who had found solid ground beneath his feet. The boat was his now. Whatever secrets she held, whatever restoration she required, whatever the town thought of his decision, she was his responsibility and his opportunity. As he'd climbed aboard for the first time, the deck creaking beneath his weight, Elias had made her a promise. "We're going to figure this out together," he'd said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty boatyard. "Whatever it takes." He'd had no idea then how much that promise would cost, or how much it would ultimately be worth. All he knew was that for the first time since Maria's death, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just trying not to drown. The compass in his pocket pointed north, steady and true, just as it always had. But Elias was beginning to suspect that the direction he needed to go wasn't marked on any navigational chart. 3 weeks into his restoration project, Elias had developed a routine that both sustained and exhausted him. Each morning at dawn, he would walk to Murphy's yard with a thermos of coffee and a toolbox that had belonged to his father. The work was slow, scraping rust, assessing damage, cataloging what could be saved and what needed replacement. But it was honest work, the kind that left his hands dirty and his mind clear. The townspeople had stopped commenting directly about his project, though he caught their sideways glances when he passed on Main Street. Some looked at him with pity, others with the resigned patience reserved for relatives who had taken up embarrassing hobbies. Only Sarah Chen continued to show genuine interest, stopping by the boatyard most afternoons to check his progress and share whatever historical information she'd uncovered about similar vessels. "She's got good bones," Sarah had said the previous Friday, running her hand along the Morning Star's restored railing. "The craftsmanship is remarkable. Whoever built her knew what they were doing." Elias had nodded, pleased that someone else could see past the surface decay to the quality beneath. He'd been thinking the same thing as he worked. Every joint he examined, every piece of hardware he cleaned, revealed attention to detail that spoke of pride in craftsmanship. The Morning Star hadn't been built quickly or cheaply. Someone had invested time and skill in creating something meant to last. On a Tuesday morning in early May, Elias was working in the boat's small galley, removing decades of accumulated grime from the cabinets, when his scraping tool hit something that didn't sound like wood. He paused, listening, then tapped again. There was definitely a hollow space behind the cabinet wall. The panel looked identical to the others, painted the same faded white, with no obvious seams or hinges. But when Elias pressed against different sections, he found one area that gave slightly under pressure. After an hour of careful work with a thin-bladed knife, he managed to pry open what revealed itself to be a false panel, so cunningly constructed that even close inspection wouldn't have revealed its existence. Behind the panel was a space about 18 inches square and 6 inches deep, lined with oiled cloth and sealed with wax. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth and tied with cord that had somehow survived the decades, was a leather journal. Elias lifted the package with the reverence, due to something that had waited patiently in darkness for longer than he'd been alive. The leather was dark with age but supple, the binding still intact. When he opened the cover, the first page bore an inscription in faded blue ink, "Property of Captain Ezra Blackwood, Master of the Meridian Grace. If found, please return to my family in Boston. Year of our Lord 1943. His hands trembling slightly, Elias turned the pages carefully. The journal was perhaps a third full, the entries written in the same careful script as the inscription. The early pages documented routine maritime business weather conditions, navigational notes, crew observations. But as he read deeper, the tone shifted, becoming more personal and increasingly urgent. 15th September, 1943. We are 3 days out of Halifax, carrying cargo that weighs heavier on my conscience than in our hold. The manifest lists agricultural equipment bound for London, but I know what lies beneath those tarps. Gold, bars upon bars of it, enough to fund armies or feed nations, depending on the hands it falls into. The papers are legitimate, but the source. God forgive us all, the source is blood money taken from the innocent. Elias felt his pulse quicken as he read on. Captain Blackwood wrote of cargo that had been recovered from German sources, gold that had been stolen from Jewish families, melted down and transformed into bars bearing official Nazi insignia. The Meridian Grace was carrying this treasure to London as part of a larger effort to track and repatriate stolen assets to their rightful owners. 20th September, 1943. The weather has turned against us, but that may be providence. I have learned through radio intercepts that corrupt elements within our own government seek to divert this cargo for their personal enrichment. They believe they can claim it as spoils of war, rather than returning it to the families who were robbed of everything else. I cannot allow this to happen. The gold must reach its intended destination, the families who survived, the organizations working to rebuild shattered lives. The entries became more sporadic as the voyage progressed, but the captain's growing desperation was evident in every line. He wrote of crew members he suspected of being in league with those who wanted to steal the cargo. Of course, changes made under cover of storms, of radio messages that went unanswered. The final entries, dated in late September 1943, made Elias's blood run cold. 25th September 1943. I have made my decision. The Meridian Grace will not reach London, not with this cargo intact. Better that this gold rest on the ocean floor than line the pockets of those who would profit from genocide. I have altered our course. My first mate suspects something, but it is too late for anyone to stop what must be done. If this journal is found, know that I acted not from cowardice but from conscience. The coordinates of our final position are recorded separately, along with detailed charts. May God forgive me for what I am about to do. The last page contained a different kind of message, written in what looked like a different pen, the handwriting less steady. To whoever finds this record, the gold aboard the Meridian Grace belongs not to governments or treasure hunters, but to the families from whom it was stolen. If you possess the means to recover it, I beg you to honor their memory. Use whatever you find, not for personal gain, but to help those whom the world has failed. This is my dying wish and my final command. The charts and coordinates are hidden separately aboard this vessel. Find them, use them wisely. Remember that some treasures are worth more than gold, they are worth justice. E. Blackwood, Captain. Elias closed the journal with shaking hands and sat in the restored galley for a long time, trying to process what he had just read. The Morning Star wasn't just any abandoned boat. She had belonged to someone connected to one of the most significant maritime disasters of World War II, a disaster that hadn't been an accident at all, but a deliberate act of moral courage. The captain had scuttled his own ship rather than allow stolen Nazi gold to be diverted from its intended purpose. And somewhere in the waters off the Maine coast, the wreck of the Meridian Grace lay waiting with a cargo worth more than money, worth justice for victims of history's greatest crime. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. How had Captain Blackwood's possessions ended up aboard the Morning Star? Had he survived the sinking? Had anyone else? And most importantly, where were the charts and coordinates he had mentioned? Elias spent the rest of the morning searching the boat more carefully, looking for additional hidden compartments. He found nothing, but he had learned to be patient. The Morning Star had kept Captain Blackwood's journal secret for 80 years. If there were more secrets to reveal, she would reveal them when she was ready. That evening, he sat in his kitchen with the journal open beside his father's compass, reading the entries again and again. Outside, Cedar Bay went about its quiet business, unaware that one of its own had stumbled upon a mystery that connected their small town to one of history's darkest chapters. The compass needle pointed steadily north, just as it always had. But Elias was beginning to understand that his true direction lay somewhere else entirely, not north or south or east or west, but deeper into the past, toward a truth that demanded to be acknowledged and a wrong that still waited to be made right. Captain Blackwood's dying wish echoed in his mind. Remember that some treasures are worth more than gold, they are worth justice. Elias thought of his mounting debts, his precarious situation, the skeptical looks from his neighbors, and his brother's practical concerns. Then he thought of families torn apart by hatred, of gold stolen from people who had already lost everything, of a ship captain who had chosen conscience over safety. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. He would find the Meridian Grace. He would honor Captain Blackwood's final command, and he would prove that some things, justice, memory, the courage to do what's right, were indeed worth more than gold. But first, he had to find those charts. The Cedar Bay Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Harbour Street, its rooms filled with the accumulated knowledge and memories of a town that had existed since before the Revolutionary War. Sarah Chen had transformed what had once been a formal parlor into a local history section, complete with maritime records, ship registries, and newspaper archives dating back to the 1800s. 3 days after finding the journal, Elias sat at the library's single computer terminal while Sarah pulled leather-bound volumes from the shelves around him. He had told her about the journal, not everything, but enough to explain his sudden interest in wartime shipping records. Sarah, bless her, had asked few questions and offered immediate help. "The Meridian Grace," she said, opening a thick book of vessel registrations. "Here she is, registered in Boston, 1939. Steel hull, 180 feet, built for cargo transport. Owner listed as Atlantic Maritime Corporation." She paused, running her finger down the page. "Interesting. There's a notation here that she was requisitioned for government service in 1942. Elias leaned over her shoulder, studying the faded type. What does that mean exactly? During the war, the government could commandeer civilian vessels for military purposes. Transport, convoy, escort, special missions, that sort of thing. Sarah turned the page, then frowned. "That's odd. The registration shows her as lost at sea, September 1943, but there's no detailed report. Usually, there would be more documentation for a vessel that size. They spent the morning cross-referencing records, building a picture of the Meridian Grace's final voyage that matched Captain Blackwood's journal entries. The ship had departed Halifax on September 12, 1943, officially bound for London with agricultural machinery. The manifest Sarah found confirmed this, though Elias now knew how misleading official documents could be. "Look at this," Sarah said, pulling out a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings. "The Bangor Daily News, October 15, 1943. Local vessel lost in Atlantic storm." It's just a short paragraph, but it mentions the Meridian Grace going down with all hands during a severe weather system off the Maine coast. Elias studied the clipping. All hands lost. But if that were true, how did Captain Blackwood's journal end up on the Morning Star? Good question. And here's another one. Why isn't there more coverage? A 180-foot cargo vessel going down with an entire crew should have been bigger news, even during wartime. The answer, Elias suspected, lay in the true nature of the cargo. If corrupt officials had been planning to steal the gold, they would have wanted as little attention as possible paid to the ship's loss. A brief mention of a storm-related sinking would discourage further investigation. By afternoon, they had moved on to studying nautical charts of the Maine coast. Sarah had found detailed surveys from the 1940s showing water depths, current patterns, and known hazards. If the Meridian Grace had gone down somewhere off Cedar Bay, there were several areas where a ship could settle and remain hidden for decades. The continental shelf drops off pretty dramatically about 12 miles southeast of here, Sarah explained, pointing to the depth markings on the chart. 200 feet of water, maybe more. Deep enough to hide a large vessel, but not so deep that it would be impossible to reach with modern diving equipment. Elias traced the depth contours with his finger, thinking about Captain Blackwood's final entries. The captain had written about altering course, about choosing the location of his ship's final rest. A man planning to scuttle his vessel would want to choose his spot carefully deep enough to ensure the cargo remained hidden, but perhaps not so deep that it could never be recovered by the right people under the right circumstances. "Sarah," he said slowly, "do you have any records about local residents in the 1940s, particularly anyone who might have been involved in maritime rescue or salvage operations?" She nodded and disappeared into the back room, returning with a set of city directories and census records. They worked together, cross-referencing names and addresses, building a picture of who had lived in Cedar Bay during the war years. "Henrik Larsson," Sarah said suddenly. "Wasn't that the previous owner of your boat?" Elias looked up from the census records. "That's right," Murphy said. "He used the Morning Star for lobstering until he died." Sarah was already flipping through the city directory. Here he is, Henrik Larsson, fisherman, residing on Anchor Street. But look at this earlier entry. From 1943, Henrik Larsson, marine salvage specialist. The pieces began clicking together in Elias's mind. Henrik Larsson hadn't just owned the Morning Star. He had been working in marine salvage during the exact time period when the Meridian Grace went down. Could he have been involved in rescue operations? Had he somehow encountered survivors of the captain's deliberate sinking? "We need to find out more about Henrik Larsson," Elias said. "Is he buried locally? Any family still in the area?" "I think he's in Cedar Bay Cemetery," Sarah replied. "No immediate family that I know of, but let me check the obituary files." She found Henrik's obituary in a 1987 edition of the Cedar Bay Gazette. Henrik Larsson, 74, longtime resident and fisherman, died peacefully at his home on Anchor Street. Born in Norway, Mr. Larsson immigrated to Cedar Bay in 1935 and worked in marine salvage operations before establishing his fishing business after the war. He is survived by no immediate family. Services will be held at St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church. "Marine salvage operations," Elias repeated. "That's quite a coincidence. Maybe not a coincidence at all, Sarah said quietly. What if Henrik Larsson was involved in the aftermath of the Meridian Grace sinking? What if that's how Captain Blackwood's journal ended up on your boat? They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications. If Henrik had been part of a rescue operation, he might have saved survivors. He might have helped Captain Blackwood himself. And if the captain had survived the sinking, he might have entrusted his possessions and his secret to the man who had pulled him from the water. There's something else, Sarah said, opening another file. Property records show that Henrik didn't just own the Morning Star. He owned several boats over the years, all of them acquired just after the war ended. For a man who supposedly worked as a fisherman, he seemed to have access to considerable capital. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. Had Henrik Larsson been rewarded for his discretion? Had someone paid him to keep quiet about what he might have witnessed? Or had he been given the means to acquire boats and build his fishing business in exchange for his silence about the Meridian Grace and her cargo? The afternoon was fading when they finally closed the books and filed the charts. Elias had learned enough to confirm that his instincts about the journal were correct. There was definitely more to the story of the Morning Star and her previous owner, but he had also learned something else. He wasn't equipped to pursue this investigation alone. "Sarah," he said as they prepared to leave the library, "I need to ask you something. What I've found, what we've been researching, it's bigger than just historical curiosity. If I'm right about this, there are people who might not want the truth to come out." She looked at him seriously. "Are you asking me if I'm prepared for this to become dangerous? I'm asking if you're prepared for this to become complicated. Morally, legally, practically, this isn't just about finding an old shipwreck anymore." Sarah Chen had moved to Cedar Bay, seeking a simpler life, a place where she could pursue her love of history without the pressures and complications of city living. But as she looked at Elias Hartwell, this decent man who had stumbled onto something that could change his life forever, she realized that some complications were worth accepting. "Show me the charts when you find them," she said simply. "We'll figure out the rest together." Walking home through the quiet streets of Cedar Bay, Elias felt the weight of Captain Blackwood's journal in his jacket pocket. The leather was warm from being carried close to his body, and he found himself touching it periodically, as if to confirm that it was real, that this incredible discovery wasn't just his imagination. The nautical charts Sarah had shown him were now memorized in his mind. 12 miles southeast, 200 feet of water. A place where a man could hide something forever, or until the right person came looking for it. Tomorrow, he would continue searching the Morning Star for the charts and coordinates that Captain Blackwood had mentioned. Tonight, he would study the journal again, looking for clues he might have missed. But first, he needed to visit Cedar Bay Cemetery and have a conversation with the grave of Henrik Larsson. The next morning brought the kind of Maine weather that reminded fishermen why they earned their living the hard way. Grey clouds hung low over Cedar Bay, and a steady drizzle turned the gravel paths of the cemetery into treacherous mud. Elias picked his way between weathered headstones, following the groundskeeper's directions to the section where Henrik Larsson had been laid to rest. The grave was simple, a modest granite marker bearing only the man's name and dates, surrounded by the kind of wild grass that grew when no one tended a plot regularly. Elias stood before it for a long time, studying the inscription and thinking about the questions that had kept him awake most of the night. "What did you see out there, Henrik?" he asked quietly. "And what made you keep it secret for so many years?" The cemetery offered no answers. Only the sound of rain pattering against stone and the distant cry of gulls. But as Elias turned to leave, something caught his eye, a small bouquet of flowers, fresh enough that they couldn't have been there long, placed carefully against the base of Henrik's headstone. Someone still remembered Henrik Larsson. Someone still visited his grave. Elias crouched down and examined the flowers, daisies and baby's breath, wrapped in simple paper and tied with a blue ribbon. There was no card, no indication of who had left them, but their presence suggested that Henrik's death hadn't been as solitary as his obituary indicated. The revelation energized him. Back at Murphy's boatyard, he renewed his search of the morning star with fresh determination. If Henrik had indeed helped Captain Blackwood, there might be more hidden compartments, more secrets waiting to be discovered. The search took most of the morning. Elias examined every surface, tapping walls and floors, probing for hollow spaces or false panels. The boat revealed nothing new until he reached the wheelhouse, where years of weather had warped one section of the instrument panel. What had seemed like simple damage now appeared to be concealing something more deliberate. After careful work with his knife, he managed to pry away a section of the panel that had been skillfully modified to appear damaged. Behind it was another oiled cloth package, smaller than the first but wrapped with the same meticulous care. Inside, he found what Captain Blackwood had promised, hand-drawn nautical charts showing the waters off Cedar Bay, marked with precise coordinates and detailed depth soundings. The charts were annotated in the captain's careful script, with notations about currents, seasonal weather patterns, and the exact location where the Meridian Grace had met her end. But there was something else in the package, a small, corroded locket containing a faded photograph. The picture showed a woman and two children, the kind of formal portrait that families had taken in the 1930s. On the back, someone had written in pencil, Anna, David, and Rebecca Goldstein, Berlin 1938. Elias stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling the weight of history in his hands. This wasn't just treasure hunting anymore, it was archaeology of the heart, the recovery of lives and stories that had been lost to time and tragedy. Anna Goldstein and her children might have been among the victims whose gold was aboard the Meridian Grace. Captain Blackwood had carried their photograph, their memory, to the bottom of the sea. The coordinates on the chart placed the wreck approximately 15 miles southeast of Cedar Bay, in water that the charts marked as 220 feet deep. Modern diving equipment could reach such depths, though it would require careful planning and experienced divers. More importantly, it would require a boat capable of reaching the location and supporting dive operations. Elias was studying the charts when he heard footsteps approaching across the gravel. He looked up to see a man he didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed despite the weather, with the kind of confidence that came from being accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Hartwell?" the stranger said, extending a manicured hand. "Vincent Carrera. I represent certain interests that might be beneficial to your current project." Elias carefully folded the charts and slipped them into his jacket pocket. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about." Vincent smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "The Morning Star. Your recent acquisition. I understand you've been doing some interesting restoration work. Just trying to get an old boat seaworthy again. Nothing interesting about that." "Oh, I think there might be more to it than that." Vincent walked closer to the boat, running his hand along the hull with the practiced eye of someone who knew vessels. "This particular boat has an unusual history. Previous owner was Henrik Larsson, wasn't he? Man had some fascinating connections during the war years." The casual mention of Henrik's wartime activities sent alarm bells ringing in Elias's mind. This wasn't a coincidental encounter. Vincent Carrera knew something, had been investigating, had possibly been watching Elias's activities at the boatyard. "Like I said, I'm just fixing up an old fishing boat." Vincent nodded as if he understood the need for discretion. "Of course. But let me suggest something, Mr. Hartwell. Projects like this can be expensive. Restoration costs, equipment needs, operational expenses, they add up quickly. I represent people who might be interested in providing financial backing for the right kind of maritime venture." "What kind of venture would that be?" "Historical salvage. There are many vessels lost in these waters during the war. Vessels that might contain items of historical and financial significance. My associates have the resources to fund proper recovery operations in partnership with knowledgeable local individuals." Elias felt his jaw tighten. And what would these associates expect in return for their investment? A fair share of any recovery. Standard salvage partnerships. Everyone benefits. Local knowledge gets properly funded, historical artifacts get recovered and preserved, and all parties receive compensation commensurate with their contributions. The offer was smoothly presented, reasonable on the surface, but Elias could hear the underlying threat. Vincent Carrera and his associates knew about the Meridian Grace. They were offering partnership, but the alternative, what would happen if Elias declined their generous offer, remained unspoken but clear. "I appreciate the offer," Elias said carefully, "but I'm not really in the salvage business, just trying to get a fishing boat back on the water." Vincent's smile faded slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, I think you may be underestimating the scope of what you're dealing with. Historical salvage operations require significant expertise, legal clearances, proper equipment. Attempting such work independently could lead to complications, regulatory problems, safety issues, financial liability. It would be much wiser to work with experienced professionals. I'll keep that in mind." "Please do." Vincent handed him an expensive business card. "My contact information. When you're ready to discuss this matter more seriously, I'll be available. But don't wait too long. Windows of opportunity in this business have a tendency to close unexpectedly." Vincent Carrera walked away with the same confident stride he had arrived with, leaving Elias standing beside the Morning Star, with a business card in his hand and a growing sense of urgency. Somehow, his private discovery was no longer private. The journal, the charts, the location of the Meridian Grace, all of it was known to people who had resources and connections that a simple fisherman couldn't match. That evening, Elias sat in his kitchen with Captain Blackwood's journal open before him, reading the captain's final entries again. The captain had written about corrupt officials who wanted to steal the gold for personal gain. 80 years later, it seemed that some things hadn't changed. Vincent Carrera's business card lay beside the journal, expensive paper with raised lettering. Carrera Maritime Consulting Historical Recovery Specialists. A phone number with a Boston area code and an email address that suggested serious business operations. Elias thought about the locket, about Anna Goldstein and her children, about Captain Blackwood's dying wish that the treasure be used to help those whom the world had failed. Then he thought about Vincent Carrera's smooth voice and expensive suit, about associates who had resources and expected fair shares. The choice wasn't difficult, but making it would require help, more help than a small-town librarian could provide, and more courage than he had needed to summon since Maria's death. He picked up the phone and dialed Father Miguel's number. "Father, it's Elias. I need to talk to someone about doing the right thing, even when it might be dangerous." "Come over," the priest said without hesitation. "I'll put on some coffee." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the salt from windows and the doubt from Elias's mind. Whatever came next, he would face it with his conscience clear, and Captain Blackwood's final command firmly in his heart. Father Miguel Santana's rectory sat behind St. Bartholomew's Catholic Church, a modest building that had served as home to Cedar Bay's priests for over a century. At 42, Miguel was younger than most of his parishioners expected in a priest, but his calm wisdom and genuine compassion had earned him deep respect in the 5 years since his arrival from Boston. He had officiated at more funerals than weddings in his time in Cedar Bay, and had learned to recognize the difference between grief that would heal and grief that would destroy. When Elias arrived that evening, soaked from the rain and carrying a canvas bag that he held protectively against his chest, Miguel knew he was looking at a man who had reached a crossroads. "Sit down," the priest said, pouring coffee from a pot that was always ready. "Tell me what's troubling you." Elias sat at the kitchen table where Miguel counseled parishioners, ate his solitary meals, and prepared his sermons. The rectory was spartanly furnished but comfortable, filled with books and the kind of simple objects that suggested a life devoted to service rather than accumulation. Father, if you found something that belonged to people who were murdered, something valuable that could help their families or others like them, but recovering it might put you in danger, what would be the right thing to do? Miguel studied his friend's face in the lamplight. That's a very specific hypothetical question, Elias. It's not hypothetical. Elias opened his canvas bag and withdrew Captain Blackwood's journal, the nautical charts, and the locket containing the Goldstein family photograph. He told Miguel everything: the discovery aboard the Morning Star, the research with Sarah, the encounter with Vincent Carrera, and his growing understanding that he had stumbled onto something much larger and more dangerous than a simple treasure hunt. Miguel listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, but never expressing disbelief. When Elias finished, the priest sat quietly for several minutes, studying the photograph of Anna Goldstein and her children. "These people," Miguel said finally, "they're all dead now. Even the children would be in their 90s if they survived the war." "I know, but the principle remains. That gold was stolen from families like this. Captain Blackwood died, trying to make sure it went back where it belonged. If I can find the wreck, I can honor his wishes. And if you can't, if this Vincent Carrera and his associates take it for themselves?" Elias touched the locket gently. "Then Anna Goldstein and her children will have been robbed twice." Miguel rose and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a worn volume of Catholic social teaching. "The Church has always held that property stolen from victims of genocide must be returned to the survivors or their designated representatives, not claimed by opportunists. What you're describing isn't treasure hunting, it's a moral obligation. But is it worth risking my life, worth potentially putting other people in danger?" The priest closed the book and looked directly at Elias. "Only you can answer that. But consider this. You're not the first person in Cedar Bay to face such a choice." Miguel disappeared into his study and returned with a manila folder. "I've been the priest here for 5 years, but I've made it my business to learn the history of this parish, including the history of some unusual confessions I found in the records." He opened the folder and withdrew a sheet of paper covered in faded handwriting. "This is from the confession notes of Father Patrick O'Brien, who served here from 1935 to 1960. He kept detailed records, which wasn't typical, but he seemed to understand that some secrets were too important to trust to memory alone." Elias leaned forward as Miguel read from the document. "September 15, 1943. H.L. came to confession in great distress. Cannot reveal details due to seal of confession, but a man has died in his arms, a sea captain who begged him to keep certain possessions safe until someone worthy could be found to honor final wishes. H.L. It has agreed to this burden, though he fears he may not be strong enough to carry it alone. I have assured him that God provides strength for those who choose righteousness over personal gain. H.L. Elias whispered. "Henrik Larsson." "The records continue for several years," Miguel said, turning pages. "Henrik came to confession regularly, always struggling with the weight of his secret. Father O'Brien notes that H.L. was considering moving away from Cedar Bay several times, but always decided to stay. He believes the burden was given to him for a reason," the priest wrote in 1947. "He will wait for the right person to appear." The implications struck Elias like a physical blow. Henrik Larsson hadn't just found Captain Blackwood's possessions, he had been entrusted with them by the dying captain himself. For over 40 years, Henrik had carried the secret, waiting for someone to appear who could complete the captain's mission. Father O'Brien's final entry about Henrik is from 1985, Miguel continued. 2 years before Henrik's death. H.L. grows frail, but his faith remains strong. He has prepared everything for the one who will come after. He believes the boat will choose its next owner, just as it chose him. His only fear is that he has waited too long. Elias felt tears burning his eyes. Henrik Larsson had spent his entire adult life as the guardian of Captain Blackwood's secret, living modestly, never using his knowledge for personal gain, trusting that someday the right person would appear. And when that person finally arrived, a desperate fisherman with $300 and a willingness to see beauty in something others dismissed as worthless, Henrik's vigil had finally ended. "The boat chose me," Elias said quietly. Henrik believed it would. According to these records, he was convinced that Captain Blackwood's spirit would guide the morning star to someone who would honor the captain's final wishes. Miguel refilled their coffee cups while Elias absorbed this revelation. The priest's kitchen felt like a sanctuary now, a place where secrets could be shared and burdens could be understood, if not relieved. "So what do I do, Father? Vincent Carrera isn't going to simply go away, and I suspect his associates aren't the kind of people who take no for an answer gracefully." "You do what Henrik Larsson did," Miguel said simply. "You carry the burden with dignity, and you trust that you won't have to carry it alone." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning that you tell Sarah Chen everything. You tell your brother Marcus, despite his practical objections. You find allies, people who understand that some things are more important than personal safety. And you remember that Captain Blackwood didn't face his final decision alone either. He had a crew who supported him, even unto death." Miguel stood and walked to his window, looking out at the dark harbor where generations of Cedar Bay men had made their living from the sea. "This town has kept secrets before. During Prohibition, half the boats in the harbor were running rum from Canada. During World War II, fishing vessels reported U-boat sightings and rescued torpedoed sailors. We know how to keep our mouths shut when it matters. And if Carrera brings pressure, legal threats, financial intimidation, then we deal with it as a community. But Elias, there's something else you need to consider. That ship's bell you mentioned finding in the debris field, if it's genuine, if it can be authenticated as belonging to the Meridian Grace, it's not just evidence of the wreck's location, it's proof of Captain Blackwood's story." Elias had almost forgotten about the bell in the larger drama of the journal and charts. He had pulled it from the ocean floor during his first dive to the coordinates, corroded and encrusted, but unmistakably bearing the ship's name. "I have it at home," he said, cleaned it up enough to read the inscription. "Then you have more than just a treasure map. You have historical evidence that could involve maritime authorities, Holocaust restitution organizations, international law. Vincent Carrera might have resources, but he doesn't have legitimacy. You do." Miguel returned to the table and placed his hand on Captain Blackwood's journal. This document, properly authenticated, could change how the world understands one small piece of World War II history. It's not just about gold anymore, it's about bearing witness to courage, about honoring the memory of victims, about completing a mission that a dying man entrusted to the sea. "You're saying I should go public with this?" "I'm saying you should consider it, but carefully and with proper support. There are organizations that specialize in recovering looted Nazi gold, in returning stolen assets to their rightful owners or their designated beneficiaries. They have legal resources, historical expertise, and the authority to do this properly." Elias thought about Anna Goldstein and her children, about the thousands of other families whose possessions had been stolen and melted down into anonymous bars of gold. Captain Blackwood had tried to ensure that this particular cache would reach its intended destination. Henrik Larsson had guarded the secret for decades, waiting for someone who could complete the mission. "There's something else," Elias said, pulling out the ship's bell. Even cleaned, it was heavily corroded, but the engraving was clear. USS Meridian Grace, 1939. Miguel examined the bell carefully. "This changes everything. With this as proof, you're not just treasure hunting, you're conducting legitimate historical recovery. But it also means Carrera's people will be even more desperate to claim it for themselves." "What would you do, Father?" "In my position?" Miguel smiled, the first time he had done so all evening. I would remember that I'm not in this alone. Henrik Larsson trusted that the right person would appear when the time was right. Captain Blackwood trusted that his final wishes would eventually be honored. And I would trust that God doesn't give people burdens they can't carry. He just sometimes requires them to ask for help. As if summoned by the priest's words, there was a knock at the rectory door. Miguel went to answer it and returned with Sarah Chen, her jacket dripping from the continuing rain. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I saw Elias's truck and thought, well, I found something at the library that couldn't wait until morning." She pulled a folder from her bag, glancing at the artifacts spread across Miguel's kitchen table. "I see you've told Father Miguel about our discovery." "Sarah," Elias said, "there are some things I haven't told you yet, things that make this situation more complicated than we realized." He told her about Vincent Carrera's visit, about the business card with its implied threats, about the growing certainty that their private investigation was no longer private. Sarah listened with the same calm attention she brought to her historical research, asking occasional questions but showing no signs of wanting to withdraw from the developing situation. "That explains what I found this afternoon," she said when he finished. "I was researching Vincent Carrera and his company. Carrera Maritime Consulting exists, but it's a very recent creation, incorporated in Delaware just 6 months ago. The registered address is a mail drop in Boston. Very little public information about their actual operations or clients." "What does that mean?" Elias asked. "It means they're probably not a legitimate historical salvage company. More likely, they're a front organization created specifically to pursue whatever they know about the Meridian Grace, which suggests they've been investigating this for some time." Miguel poured Sarah a cup of coffee and gestured for her to sit. "What else did you find?" "Property records. Carrera Maritime has been making inquiries about purchasing waterfront property in Cedar Bay. They've approached 3 different landowners in the past month, always asking about properties with deep water access, suitable for marine operations." The implications were clear. Vincent Carrera's people weren't just interested in the treasure, they were planning to establish a base of operations in Cedar Bay itself, which meant they intended to stay until they got what they came for. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I also found records of similar inquiries in other coastal Maine towns, Bar Harbor, Camden, Rockland. Always the same pattern, a new company making cash offers for marine properties, asking questions about local maritime history, specifically about World War II-era vessels. They're working multiple leads," Elias realized. "The Morning Star might not be their only source of information about wartime wrecks, but it might be their best one," Miguel said. "And now they know you have it." The 3 of them sat in the priest's kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of a decades-old mystery and the mounting evidence of a contemporary threat. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the harbor lay dark and quiet under the storm clouds. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. Elias looked at the locket containing the Goldstein family photograph, then at the ship's bell that proved Captain Blackwood's story was true. He thought about Henrik Larsson's 40-year vigil, about Father Miguel's conviction that some burdens were meant to be shared, about Sarah's willingness to help despite the growing danger. "We honor Captain Blackwood's wishes," he said finally, "but we do it the right way, with proper legal support and international oversight, and we do it quickly, before Carrera's people can stop us." "That means going public," Miguel warned. "Once this story breaks, there will be no going back to your quiet life." "My quiet life ended the day I bought the Morning Star," Elias replied. "I just didn't realize it at the time." The next morning brought Sarah Chen to the Cedar Bay Library before dawn, her laptop and phone ready for what she knew would be a day of intensive research and delicate communications. The government documents she had uncovered were spread across her desk, wartime shipping manifests, classified memos that had been declassified decades later, and correspondence between various agencies involved in tracking Nazi gold and other looted assets. What she had found changed everything about the Meridian Grace story. The ship hadn't been carrying just any stolen gold. It had been transporting part of the Hungarian gold train, a massive cache of valuables stolen from Hungarian Jews during the final months of the war. The train had been captured by American forces in Austria, but detailed records showed that significant portions of the treasure had been diverted for various purposes, including secret operations and diplomatic initiatives. The Meridian Grace's cargo, manifest, buried in files that had remained classified until the 1990s, listed special diplomatic materials, bound for London. But Sarah's cross-referencing with other documents revealed the truth. The ship had been carrying gold bars, jewelry, artwork, and personal effects worth an estimated $127 million in 1,943 currency, nearly $2 billion in today's values. More importantly, the documents revealed that the cargo was indeed intended for repatriation efforts. The World Jewish Congress and other organizations had been working with allied governments to identify and return looted assets to survivors and their families. Captain Blackwood hadn't just been following orders. He had been part of one of history's earliest efforts to provide justice for Holocaust victims. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final document in the file. A 1947 memo from the Office of Strategic Services, noting that the Meridian Grace had been lost with all hands and cargo, and that the repatriation program would need to continue with other recovered assets. The memo was signed by someone whose name made her blood run cold, Vincent Carrera Sr. She immediately called Elias, catching him as he was preparing to leave for the boatyard. "Elias, you need to get over here immediately and bring the journal and charts with you." "What did you find?" "Vincent Carrera isn't just some treasure hunter. His family has been involved in this story since the beginning." 20 minutes later, Elias sat in the library's back room, studying the documents Sarah had laid out. The implications were staggering. Vincent Carrera Sr. had been part of the original team responsible for tracking the Meridian Grace's cargo. When the ship was reported lost, he would have known exactly what had gone down with her. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a personnel file. Vincent Carrera Sr. was dismissed from the OSS in 1948 for irregularities in asset tracking procedures. The file suggests he was suspected of diverting recovered treasures for personal gain, but formal charges were never filed. "So the son is finishing what the father started," Elias said grimly. "It gets worse. I found records showing that Carrera Sr. made multiple trips to Maine in the late 1940s and early 1950s, always to coastal towns, always asking questions about wartime shipping losses. He was looking for the Meridian Grace, even then." Elias thought about Henrik Larsson's confession records, about the fisherman's fear that he might not be strong enough to carry his burden alone. Had Henrik encountered Carrera Sr. during those years? Had he been forced to guard Captain Blackwood's secret, not just from time and forgetfulness, but from active pursuit by someone who wanted to claim the treasure? "There's more," Sarah continued, opening another file. "I contacted the World Jewish Restitution Organization this morning. They have extensive records of Nazi gold recovery efforts, including the Hungarian gold train cargo. When I described what we'd found, they immediately put me in touch with their chief investigator." She handed Elias a business card. "Dr. Rachel Stern. She's flying up from New York this afternoon. The WJRO has been tracking missing portions of the Hungarian gold train for decades. If we can prove that the Meridian Grace was carrying part of that shipment, they have the legal authority to claim it on behalf of the victims' families and survivor organizations. Legal authority that Vincent Carrera doesn't have," Elias realized. "Exactly, but only if we can get to the wreck first and establish legitimate salvage operations before he can interfere." Elias studied the documents, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. This wasn't just about honoring Captain Blackwood's wishes anymore. It was about completing one small piece of the massive effort to restore justice to Holocaust victims. The gold in the Meridian Grace's hold represented more than money. It represented families, lives, memories that had been stolen and could still be returned to where they belonged. But it also meant that Vincent Carrera would be even more desperate to claim the treasure before legitimate authorities could intervene. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If we pursue this, if we contact the WJRO officially, if we try to organize a legitimate salvage operation, we're going to make ourselves targets. Carrera's people won't just make threats, they'll take action to protect what they see as their opportunity. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph of Anna Goldstein and her children. My grandmother was in Shanghai during the war, she said finally. She was one of the lucky ones. She got out of Germany before the worst happened, but she lost everyone else. Cousins, aunts, uncles, friends. When she died, she still had a shoebox full of letters from people trying to find missing relatives, trying to recover family heirlooms, trying to get back some small piece of what had been stolen from them. She looked directly at Elias. If there's a chance that some of this gold originally belonged to families like my grandmother's, then we have to try, whatever the risk, even if it means putting yourself in danger. Especially then, because the people who originally owned this treasure didn't have a choice about the danger they faced. The least we can do is accept some risk to honor their memory. Elias felt a surge of admiration for this woman who had moved to Cedar Bay seeking a quiet life, but was now willing to risk everything for the sake of historical justice. All right, we do this properly. We contact Dr. Stern, we establish legitimate legal framework, and we organize a salvage operation that can't be challenged in court. There's one more thing, Sarah said. I think we should tell Marcus what's really going on. If Carrera's people escalate their pressure, you're going to need family support. And Marcus might surprise you. He's more principled than he lets on. Elias thought about his brother's practical objections to the Morning Star purchase, about their recent arguments over money and responsibility. But Sarah was right. Marcus was fundamentally decent, and he had never backed down from a fight when he believed in the cause. I'll talk to him tonight, Elias agreed. After Dr. Stern's meeting, they spent the rest of the morning organizing their documentation and preparing for the WJRO investigators' arrival. Sarah had created detailed files, correlating Captain Blackwood's journal entries with official government documents, establishing a clear chain of evidence that connected the Morning Star to the Meridian Grace, to the Hungarian gold train recovery effort. At noon, as they were finalizing their presentation, Sarah's phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, then turned pale. That was Dr. Stern, she said after hanging up. Her flight was delayed. She won't be here until tomorrow morning. That's not necessarily bad news, Elias said. It gives us more time to prepare. No, you don't understand. She didn't say her flight was delayed by weather or mechanical problems. She said there had been complications with her travel arrangements. Someone called the airline claiming there was a security issue with her ticket. Elias felt his stomach drop. Carrera? Has to be. They're already moving to interfere with legitimate investigation, which means they're probably escalating other pressure too. As if summoned by her words, Elias's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Hartwell, my offer of partnership remains open, but not indefinitely. Some opportunities have expiration dates. I suggest we meet again soon to discuss terms that might be more favorable to all parties involved. They're not going to wait much longer, Elias said, showing Sarah the message. We need to move faster. Or we need help, Sarah replied, reaching for her phone again. I'm calling the Maine State Police. It's time to get law enforcement involved. And tell them what? That we found a journal in an old boat and now we're being threatened by treasure hunters? We tell them that we've uncovered evidence of a World War II-era shipwreck containing assets stolen from Holocaust victims, and that we're being pressured by individuals attempting to interfere with legitimate restitution efforts. We have documentation, we have official interest from recognized international organizations, and we have evidence of intimidation tactics. Sarah was already dialing as she spoke. Whatever happened next, their quiet investigation was about to become very public indeed. Outside the library windows, Cedar Bay continued its daily routine, unaware that the small coastal town was about to become the center of an international controversy involving Nazi gold, family justice, and the completion of a mission that had begun 80 years earlier in the waters off their peaceful harbor. That evening, while Sarah worked with Maine State Police Detective Linda Morrison to document their evidence and concerns, Elias returned to the Morning Star for what he intended to be a final, thorough search. If they were going public with their discovery, he wanted to be certain they had found everything Captain Blackwood had hidden aboard Henrik Larsen's boat. The spring evening was unusually warm, and the boatyard was quiet, except for the sound of water lapping against hulls and the distant cry of gulls settling for the night. Elias had brought proper lighting this time, work lamps that illuminated every corner of the boat's interior as he methodically examined areas he had already searched multiple times. It was in the engine compartment, while he was checking behind the auxiliary fuel tank, that his light caught something that made him pause. The mounting brackets for the tank weren't original to the boat, they were newer, clearly installed after the initial construction, and they created a small space that would be invisible unless someone was lying on their back, looking up from beneath the engine. Working carefully in the cramped space, Elias managed to feel along the hidden area until his fingers encountered another oilcloth package, this one secured with wire rather than rope. It had been deliberately hidden in the most inaccessible location possible, the kind of place someone would use for their most important secrets. When he finally extracted the package and opened it in the boat's galley, what he found changed everything he thought he understood about Captain Blackwood's story. This wasn't Captain Blackwood's journal, it was written in different handwriting, in a younger person's script. The first page bore the inscription, "Personal record of Thomas Blackwood, first mate, USS, Meridian Grace. If something happens to my father, someone needs to know the truth." Thomas Blackwood had been Captain Blackwood's son, serving under his father aboard the Meridian Grace. His journal began several days before the ship's final voyage, and it told a dramatically different version of events than his father's official record. September 8, 1943. Father has told me the truth about our cargo, and I understand now why he has been so troubled these past weeks. The gold we carry was stolen from Jewish families, melted down by the Nazis into anonymous bars. We are supposed to transport it to London, where it will be distributed to refugee organizations and survivor groups. But Father has learned that certain officials plan to divert much of it for administrative costs and operational expenses. In other words, they intend to steal from the victims a second time. Elias read with growing amazement as Thomas Blackwood described his father's growing desperation and the plan they developed together, not just to scuttle the ship, but to ensure that at least some of the treasure could eventually reach its rightful destination. September 10, 1943. Father and I have selected the location, 12 miles southeast of a small fishing village called Cedar Bay. The water is deep enough to hide the ship, but not so deep that recovery would be impossible with proper equipment. We have also made contact with a local fisherman named Henrik Larsen, who has agreed to help us. Henrik understands that what we are doing serves justice, not greed. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Captain Blackwood hadn't just died trying to prevent theft of the gold he had survived the sinking. And Henrik Larsen hadn't just rescued him by chance. He had been part of a deliberate plan to preserve the treasure for future recovery. Thomas Blackwood's journal continued with details that explained everything that had puzzled Elias. The captain and his son had used lifeboats to transfer a portion of the gold, the most valuable and easily transportable pieces, to Henrik's fishing boat before scuttling the Meridian Grace. The majority of the treasure had gone down with the ship, but Captain Blackwood had kept enough to eventually fund a proper recovery operation. September 25, 1943. The Meridian Grace rests on the ocean floor, and the world believes my father and I died with her. It was the only way to protect the treasure from those who would steal it. Henrik has agreed to hide the portable gold and guard the secret of the ship's location until someone trustworthy can be found to complete our mission. Father believes it may take years, perhaps decades, but he is confident that the right person will eventually appear. The later entries, written over several months, documented Captain Blackwood's new life in Cedar Bay. He had taken the identity of a war refugee, working quietly for Henrik while they waited for an opportunity to contact legitimate restitution organizations without alerting the corrupt officials who had originally planned to steal the gold. But the opportunity had never come. Thomas Blackwood's final entry, dated March 15, 1944, was written in an unsteady hand. Father died this morning, peacefully, in his sleep. The influenza took him quickly. Perhaps it was a mercy. He never recovered fully from the ordeal of scuttling his own ship, even though he knew it was right. Henrik and I buried him in the Catholic cemetery, under the name he had taken here. Father Patrick O'Brien said the proper words, though he could not know he was laying to rest, one of the war's unsung heroes. The burden passes to me now, and to Henrik when my time comes. We have hidden the portable treasure in a place known only to us. The ship's location and the complete story are recorded in this journal, along with detailed charts that will allow the Meridian Grace to be found, and her remaining cargo recovered. Henrik has promised to guard these secrets until someone worthy appears, someone who will honor Father's dying wish that this gold serve justice rather than greed. I pray that person comes soon. I am not as strong as my father was, and the weight of this secret grows heavier each day. The journal ended there, but tucked behind the final pages was a hand-drawn map of Cedar Bay and the surrounding area, marked with precise notations. One mark indicated the location of the Meridian Grace, wreck exactly where Elias had found the ship's bell and debris field. Another mark, closer to shore, showed a location on Cedar Bay itself, with the notation, "Emergency cash sufficient to fund proper recovery operations." Elias studied the map with trembling hands. Thomas Blackwood and Henrik Larsson had created not just one hiding place, but two. The main treasure lay with the Meridian Grace on the ocean floor, but a smaller cache still worth millions was hidden somewhere in Cedar Bay itself, waiting to provide the resources needed to mount a legitimate salvage operation. The location shown on the map was familiar. A small island about 2 miles offshore, barely more than a rocky outcrop topped with scrub pine. Locals called it Gull Island, and it was considered too small and rocky to be useful for anything except nesting seabirds. But according to Thomas Blackwood's map, it was also the resting place of enough stolen Nazi gold to change the course of Elias's investigation and to provide the proof that would establish once and for all the legitimate nature of their discovery. As he sat in the morning star's galley, surrounded by the artifacts of an 80-year-old mystery, Elias realized that Captain Blackwood's story was far more complex and extraordinary than he had imagined. The captain hadn't just died a hero's death, he had lived a hero's life, sacrificing his identity, his career, and ultimately his health to ensure that stolen treasure would eventually find its way back to the families from whom it had been taken. Henrik Larsson's 40-year vigil now made perfect sense. He hadn't just been guarding Captain Blackwood's possessions, he had been fulfilling a promise made to a dying friend, waiting for someone who would have the courage and integrity to complete a mission that had begun in the darkest days of World War II. But the discovery also revealed the true scope of what Vincent Carrera was after. This wasn't just about the Meridian Grace wreck, it was about the complete recovery of one of the largest caches of Nazi gold ever identified. If Carrera's people learned about the island cache, they would have both the resources and the incentive to take whatever action was necessary to claim it. Elias carefully wrapped Thomas Blackwood's journal and the map in the oilcloth, his mind racing with the implications of what he had found. Tomorrow, when Dr. Rachel Stern arrived from the World Jewish Restitution Organization, he would have more than just Captain Blackwood's dying wish to present. He would have detailed documentation of a carefully planned operation to preserve stolen treasure for return to its rightful owners. But tonight, he had one more task to complete. According to Thomas Blackwood's map, the cache on Gull Island was marked by a cairn of stones arranged in a specific pattern. If the gold was still there after 80 years, it would provide irrefutable proof of the Blackwood story and the resources needed to mount a legitimate recovery of the Meridian Grace herself. As Elias prepared to leave the boatyard, he noticed a car parked across the street that hadn't been there when he arrived. The driver was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing in the darkness. When Elias looked directly at the vehicle, the cigarette disappeared and the car's engine started. Vincent Carrera's people were no longer content to make polite threats. They were watching, waiting, preparing to act, which meant that Elias's window of opportunity was closing faster than he had hoped. He walked home through Cedar Bay's quiet streets, Thomas Blackwood's journal hidden beneath his jacket, the weight of an 80-year-old promise pressing against his heart. Tomorrow would bring official investigations, legal frameworks, and international oversight. Tonight, under cover of darkness, he would see if two heroes of a forgotten war had truly hidden their treasure well enough to wait 8 decades for justice. At 3 o'clock in the morning, under a moonless sky that provided perfect cover for clandestine activities, Elias motored quietly across Cedar Bay's dark waters toward Gull Island. He had borrowed Tom Murphy's small outboard skiff, telling the old boat builder that he needed to check some lobster traps he had set earlier in the week. Murphy hadn't believed the excuse for a moment, but he had handed over the keys without questions, understanding that some things were better left unexplained. The crossing took 20 minutes at reduced throttle, with Elias navigating by memory and the faint outline of the island against the starry sky. Gull Island was little more than 2 acres of granite ledge, rising about 15 feet above high tide, topped with stunted pine trees and beach grass. During the day, it was home to hundreds of seabirds. At night, it was as silent as a cemetery. Elias beached the skiff on the island's only sandy spot and climbed up the rocky slope with a waterproof flashlight and the tools he would need if Thomas Blackwood's map proved accurate. The cairn marker was supposed to be at the island's highest point, arranged in a pattern that would look natural to casual observers but would be unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. He found it exactly where the map indicated 7 stones, arranged in what appeared to be a random pile, but which actually formed the pattern of the Big Dipper when viewed from the correct angle. The marker had weathered 8 decades of storms and tide, but it remained intact, still pointing the way to what lay hidden beneath. Working carefully in the darkness, Elias dismantled the cairn and began digging in the rocky soil underneath. The cache was buried deeper than he had expected, nearly 4 feet down, in a space that had been carefully excavated and lined with flat stones to prevent water infiltration. What he found there made him sit back on his heels and whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever providence had guided his steps to this moment. The cache contained 3 waterproof metal boxes, each about the size of a briefcase and heavy enough to require both hands to lift. Inside the boxes, wrapped in oiled silk and preserved as carefully as museum artifacts, were gold bars bearing Nazi eagle stamps, jewelry that sparkled even in the dim light of his flashlight, and leather pouches filled with gold coins from a dozen different countries. But more importantly, the cache contained documentation that proved beyond any doubt the legitimacy of the Blackwood operation. There were photographs of Captain Blackwood and his son in uniform, official orders authorizing the Meridian Grace's special cargo mission, and copies of correspondence with Jewish refugee organizations detailing the planned repatriation of stolen assets. One document, signed by officials from both the U.S. Treasury Department and the World Jewish Congress, specifically authorized Captain Ezra Blackwood to take whatever measures necessary to ensure that recovered Nazi gold reaches its intended beneficiaries rather than being diverted for unauthorized purposes. Elias had found the smoking gun that would establish the legal and moral legitimacy of the entire operation. Vincent Carrera could make all the threats he wanted, but he could never challenge the authority of official wartime documents that specifically empowered the Blackwood mission. The return trip to Cedar Bay took longer, with the skiff riding lower in the water due to the weight of the 3 metal boxes. Elias kept watch for other vessels, but saw none. The bay was empty, except for the few boats moored at private docks, their masts swaying gently in the light breeze. He was securing the skiff at Murphy's dock when he heard footsteps on the gravel behind him. "Working late tonight, Mr. Hartwell?" Elias turned to find Vincent Carrera standing at the end of the dock, no longer bothering with pretenses of casual conversation. 2 other men flanked him, large, professional-looking individuals who radiated the kind of quiet menace that came from extensive experience in persuading people to cooperate. "Just checking some equipment," Elias said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Equipment? Yes, I can see that." Vincent's gaze fell on the 3 metal boxes sitting in the skiff. "Interesting equipment. The kind that might require special handling, perhaps special permits." "I don't know what you mean." Vincent smiled, the same cold smile Elias had seen during their first encounter. "Mr. Hartwell, let's speak plainly. You have something that belongs to my clients. Historical artifacts that they have been seeking for a very long time. Artifacts that, I should mention, were originally classified as government property and therefore subject to specific legal frameworks that private citizens cannot navigate alone." "What clients would those be?" "Organizations with legitimate claims to wartime recovery operations. Organizations with the legal standing and financial resources to handle complex international restitution matters properly." Vincent stepped closer, his companions moving to flank Elias on the narrow dock. "What you're attempting to do, admirable though your intentions may be, is beyond your capabilities. You need professional assistance." Elias thought about the documents in the metal boxes, about Captain Blackwood's official authorization, about the photographs that would establish the legitimacy of the entire operation. Vincent Carrera was still operating under the assumption that he was dealing with an amateur treasure hunter rather than someone carrying official government documentation from the war years themselves. "And what kind of assistance would you be offering?" Elias asked. "Full professional salvage services, legal representation, connections with appropriate international organizations, and, of course, protection from the various complications that can arise when private individuals attempt to handle matters of this complexity without proper support." The implied threat was clearer now. Vincent's protection was protection from problems that he and his people would create if Elias didn't cooperate. "I appreciate the offer," Elias said, "but I think I can manage." Vincent's expression hardened. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't think you fully understand your situation. The materials you've recovered are not just valuable, they're dangerous. There are people who have been looking for these particular items for decades, people with resources and motivations that go far beyond simple financial interest. Your amateur investigation has attracted attention that could put you and your friends in serious jeopardy." "What kind of attention?" "The kind that results in accidents, boating mishaps, house fires, the sort of tragedies that happen when people dig too deeply into matters that were meant to remain buried." Elias felt his jaw tighten with anger. These weren't just threats anymore. They were promises of violence against anyone who stood in the way of Vincent's operation. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to save your life," Vincent said with what sounded like genuine sincerity. "And the lives of people you care about. Sarah Chen, for instance. Lovely young woman, very dedicated to her historical research. It would be unfortunate if her curiosity led to complications." The mention of Sarah's name sent ice through Elias's veins. These people had been watching, studying, preparing. They knew about everyone involved in the investigation, and they were prepared to target anyone who posed a threat to their plans. "What do you want?" Elias asked. "Cooperation. You turn over the materials you've recovered, you provide us with the location information you've discovered, and you allow professionals to handle the recovery operations. In exchange, you receive a generous finder's fee and the satisfaction of knowing that historical justice will be served properly. And if I refuse?" Vincent glanced at his companions, who moved slightly closer. "Then you will discover that some kinds of historical research can be hazardous to your health, and to the health of people who try to help you." Elias looked at the three men standing between him and the shore, then at the metal boxes containing proof that Captain Blackwood had acted with full government authority. He thought about Sarah Chen working late at the library, about Father Miguel sleeping peacefully in his rectory, about Marcus and the life he had built in his careful, practical way. But he also thought about Anna Goldstein and her children, about Thomas Blackwood's dying wish, about Henrik Larsson's 40-year vigil, waiting for someone worthy to appear. "I need time to consider your offer," Elias said finally. "Time is a luxury you don't have," Vincent replied. "My clients are not patient people. They've been waiting 80 years for this opportunity, and they're not inclined to wait much longer." "How long?" 24 hours. Tomorrow night, same time, same place. You bring everything you've found, and we conclude this business in a way that benefits everyone involved." Vincent and his companions stepped aside, allowing Elias to pass. But as he reached for the metal boxes, one of the larger men placed a hand on his arm. "Leave those," Vincent said quietly. "Consider them a gesture of good faith. We'll discuss their disposition tomorrow evening." Elias looked at the boxes containing Thomas Blackwood's cash, then at the three men who were clearly prepared to use force if necessary. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated on a dark dock with no witnesses and no backup. 24 hours, he agreed. 24 hours, Vincent confirmed. "And Mr. Hartwell, I would strongly advise against involving law enforcement or outside organizations in this matter. Some problems are better resolved privately, between reasonable people." The three men disappeared into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Elias standing alone on the dock with empty hands and a growing sense of urgency. Vincent Carrera now had Thomas Blackwood's cash, which meant he had proof of the treasure's existence and value. But more importantly, he had made it clear that he was prepared to use violence against anyone who stood in his way. Elias walked quickly back to his truck, his mind racing with the implications of the confrontation. He needed help, professional help, legal help, and probably physical protection as well. But Vincent's warning about involving law enforcement carried weight. If Carrera's people were prepared to commit violence to protect their operation, they were probably prepared to escalate dramatically if they felt cornered. The drive home took him past Sarah's apartment above the library, where lights were still burning despite the late hour. He pulled over and saw her silhouette moving past the windows. She was still awake, still working on their investigation. Elias sat in his truck for several minutes, watching those lighted windows and thinking about Vincent's casual mention of Sarah's name. These people knew where she lived, knew her routines, knew how to find her when they wanted to apply pressure, and they had made it clear that anyone who helped Elias would become a target. But they had also made a mistake. By taking Thomas Blackwood's cash, they had revealed the extent of their knowledge and their desperation. They weren't just interested in the Meridian Grace wreck they were, after the complete recovery of the stolen Nazi gold, and they were prepared to commit serious crimes to get it, which meant that this was no longer a matter for amateur investigators and local police. This was a federal case involving stolen Nazi assets, international restitution efforts, and organized criminals who were prepared to use violence to achieve their goals. Elias pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah's number. "Sarah, it's Elias. Are you alone?" "Yes, why?" "You sound... Lock your doors and don't let anyone in except people you know personally. Vincent Carrera just made it clear that you're a target." "What happened?" "They were waiting for me when I got back from Gull Island. They took Thomas Blackwood's cash, and they made threats against you specifically. We need to escalate this immediately. Federal authorities, international organizations, media attention, if necessary." "Elias, slow down. Start from the beginning." He told her about the second journal, about the cash on Gull Island, about the confrontation with Vincent and his men. Sarah listened without interruption, and when he finished, her voice was steady but grim. "Dr. Stern's flight lands in Bangor at 8 tomorrow morning. I've arranged for Detective Morrison to meet her at the airport and escort her here. The state police are taking this seriously. They've been researching Carrera Maritime, and they've found connections to other questionable salvage operations. Will that be enough?" "It has to be, because we're not just fighting Vincent Carrera anymore. I spent tonight researching his father's OSS records, and I found something disturbing. Vincent Carrera Sr. wasn't just suspected of diverting recovered Nazi gold. He was suspected of working with a network of former Nazi officials who had escaped to South America after the war." Elias felt his blood chill. "Meaning what?" "Meaning that Vincent Jr. might not be representing American treasure hunters. He might be representing the same people who originally stole this gold from Jewish families. People who view this not as historical recovery, but as reclaiming what they consider their property." The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, then the Meridian Grace treasure represented more than just a financial opportunity for Vincent Carrera's clients. It represented a chance to recover assets that had been stolen from the original thieves 80 years ago. "Sarah, you need to get out of Cedar Bay tonight. Drive to your sister's place in Portland or get a hotel room somewhere public with lots of witnesses." "I'm not running away, Elias. We're too close to completing Captain Blackwood's mission to quit now. These people are dangerous. They're not just treasure hunters, they're connected to war criminals. All the more reason to see this through. Dr. Stern's organization has been tracking Nazi gold networks for decades. When she sees what we've found, she'll have the authority to involve federal agencies that can shut down Carrera's operation permanently." But will we survive long enough for that to happen?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "There's something else. I called Father Miguel after you left tonight. I told him everything we'd discovered, everything we suspected about Carrera's connections. He's been making some calls of his own." "What kind of calls?" "Remember, he came here from Boston. He still has connections there, people in the Archdiocese, people in Catholic organizations that have been involved in Holocaust remembrance and restitution efforts. He thinks he can get us protection, but it means going completely public with the story. Media attention, international attention, the kind of attention that makes it very difficult for people to commit violence without consequences." Elias thought about the peaceful life he had been living just weeks ago, the simple problems of boat restoration and overdue bills. Now he was contemplating becoming the center of an international controversy involving Nazi gold, war criminals, and federal law enforcement. But he also thought about Captain Blackwood's naval medal, which he had brought home from the Morning Star, and which now sat on his kitchen table beside his father's compass. The medal represented honor, sacrifice, and the courage to do what was right, despite personal cost. "All right," he said finally, "we go public. But we do it smart. Federal agencies first, then Dr. Stern's organization, then media, if necessary. And we do it fast, before Vincent's 24-hour deadline expires." "What happens if we can't get protection in time?" Elias looked at his father's compass, its needle pointing steadily north toward whatever lay ahead. "Then we trust that Henrik Larsson was right about the Morning Star. choosing the right person for this job. And if he was wrong, then Captain Blackwood's mission ends with us. But at least it doesn't end with Vincent Carrera. Outside his kitchen window, Cedar Bay slept peacefully under the dark sky, unaware that dawn would bring federal investigators, international attention, and the resolution of a mystery that had waited 80 years for justice. Dr. Rachel Stern arrived in Cedar Bay at 10 o'clock the next morning, accompanied by Detective Morrison and 2 federal agents whose credentials identified them as specialists in international asset recovery. The convoy of official vehicles drew considerable attention as it made its way through the town's quiet streets to the library, where Sarah had assembled all their documentation and evidence. Dr. Stern was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of intense focus that came from dedicating one's life to seeking justice for historical wrongs. She examined Captain Blackwood's original journal with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades authenticating similar documents, then studied Thomas Blackwood's second journal with growing excitement. "This is extraordinary," she said, looking up from the pages. "We've been tracking the Hungarian gold train shipments for 30 years, but this is the first time we've found detailed documentation of Captain Blackwood's operation. The World Jewish Restitution Organization has theoretical authority to claim these assets, but we've never had proof that they actually existed." Federal agent Patricia Collins, a specialist in Nazi war crimes and stolen art recovery, spread Thomas Blackwood's charts across the library table. These coordinates place the wreck in international waters, which simplifies jurisdictional issues. If we can establish the legitimacy of the claim, we can organize official recovery operations under international treaty protocols. "What about Vincent Carrera?" Elias asked. "He has the cash from Gull Island, and he's made it clear he's not going to simply walk away from this." Agent Collins exchanged glances with her partner, Agent David Kim. "We've been investigating Carrera Maritime for several months as part of a larger investigation into stolen Nazi assets. What you've discovered here connects to a network we believe has been operating internationally, using legitimate-seeming salvage companies to recover and launder stolen wartime treasure." Detective Morrison opened a file folder containing surveillance photographs. "Carrera isn't working alone. We've identified at least 6 associates who arrived in Cedar Bay over the past week, all with backgrounds in private security and marine operations. They've rented boats, diving equipment, and a waterfront warehouse space in Millbrook. They're preparing for immediate recovery operations." Dr. Stern realized, if they can recover the Meridian Grace's cargo and transport it out of U.S. waters, it becomes much more difficult to establish legitimate claims. Sarah pulled out her laptop and showed the group what she had discovered during her sleepless night of research. "There's more. Vincent Carrera Sr.'s OSS records show connections to something called Operation Bernhard, a Nazi counterfeiting operation that was also involved in laundering stolen gold. The network that employed Carrera Sr. has been tracking missing Nazi assets for decades, using legitimate-looking companies to pursue recovery operations." Agent Kim studied the documents on the screen. "So, Vincent Jr. isn't just a treasure hunter. He's working for an organization that considers this gold to be rightfully theirs because they originally stole it." "That's our assessment," Sarah confirmed, "which means they're not going to be deterred by legal challenges or law enforcement involvement. From their perspective, this is about recovering property that belongs to them." Dr. Stern closed Captain Blackwood's journal carefully. "Then we need to move immediately. How quickly can we organize legitimate salvage operations?" "The NOAA vessel, Discovery, is conducting research operations about 50 miles north of here," Agent Collins said, consulting her phone. "With proper authorization, we could have professional dive teams and recovery equipment on site within 12 hours. "And what about Elias's safety?" Father Miguel asked. He had been quietly observing the discussion, but now his concern was evident. Vincent Carrera gave him a 24-hour ultimatum. When that deadline passes without cooperation, what happens? Agent Kim's expression was grim. Based on our investigation of similar operations, they'll escalate to direct action. Recovery operations, probably tonight, with or without local cooperation. Meaning they'll take the treasure and eliminate any witnesses who could threaten their operation, Detective Morrison added bluntly. Elias felt the weight of Captain Blackwood's naval medal in his pocket, the brass warm from being carried close to his heart. For 80 years, the captain's mission had waited for someone with the courage to see it through. Now, in the final hours, that courage was being tested in ways Captain Blackwood himself might never have imagined. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Dr. Stern smiled the first time she had done so since arriving. "Everything you've found, and your permission to act on behalf of the original victims. The World Jewish Restitution Organization can provide legal standing. Federal agencies can provide protection and enforcement, and NOAA can provide recovery capabilities. But we need someone with direct knowledge of the discovery to serve as official witness to the legitimacy of the operation. You're asking me to testify that what we found is genuine? I'm asking you to complete Captain Blackwood's mission," she said simply. He trusted that the right person would eventually appear. Henrik Larsson trusted that the Morning Star would choose someone worthy. Now it's time to honor that trust. Outside the library windows, Cedar Bay continued its daily routine, but Elias could see unfamiliar vehicles positioned at strategic locations around the town. Vincent Carrera's people were in place, waiting for nightfall and the expiration of their deadline. The massive iron safe from the Meridian Grace was about to give up secrets that had waited 8 decades for justice. But first, they had to survive long enough to bring it to the surface. The confrontation came at sunset as the NOAA vessel, Discovery, was taking position over the Meridian Grace wreck site. Elias stood on the dock beside the Morning Star, now restored and seaworthy, watching as federal agents prepared diving equipment under the protection of Coast Guard personnel. The official recovery operation was finally beginning, 80 years after Captain Blackwood had entrusted his mission to the sea. Vincent Carrera arrived precisely at the 24-hour deadline, but this time he wasn't alone. 6 men in diving gear emerged from a large speedboat that had approached the harbor at high speed, clearly prepared for immediate underwater recovery operations. They had expected to find Elias alone and vulnerable, ready to surrender the remaining evidence in exchange for his safety. Instead, they found themselves facing federal agents, international investigators, and a fully authorized recovery operation backed by multiple government agencies. "Mr. Hartwell," Vincent called across the water, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "I see you've decided to complicate matters unnecessarily." Agent Collins stepped forward, her badge visible and her hand resting on her sidearm. "Vincent Carrera, you're under investigation for violations of federal laws regarding stolen wartime assets. I strongly advise you to withdraw your vessel and personnel from this area immediately." Vincent's response was a harsh laugh. "Agent Collins, I presume? You're operating under some significant misunderstandings about the legal status of these recovery operations. My clients have documentation establishing their legitimate salvage rights to the Printentage, Meridian Grace, and her cargo. Documentation that we'd be very interested to examine," Agent Kim replied, joining his partner on the dock. "Along with documentation establishing the identity and legal standing of your clients." "I'm afraid that's not possible. Commercial salvage operations are protected by maritime privacy laws, and my clients prefer to maintain confidentiality in their business dealings." Dr. Stern stepped into view, carrying a folder containing Thomas Blackwood's second journal and the official wartime documents that had been hidden with the Gull Island cache. "Mr. Carrera, I'm Dr. Rachel Stern from the World Jewish Restitution Organization. We have evidence that the cargo you're seeking to recover consists of assets stolen from Holocaust victims and designated for repatriation under international treaties to which the United States is a signatory." Vincent's confident demeanor faltered slightly as he recognized the implications of official international involvement. "Dr. Stern, I'm familiar with your organization's work, and I respect it greatly, but you're operating under incomplete information about the nature and ownership of these particular assets. Then perhaps you'd like to examine this, Dr." Stern said, holding up one of the documents from Thomas Blackwood's cache. Official authorization from the U.S. Treasury Department and the World Jewish Congress, dated 1943, specifically empowering Captain Ezra Blackwood to ensure that recovered Nazi gold reaches its intended beneficiaries rather than being diverted for unauthorized purposes. The document was clearly visible, even from Vincent's position on the water, and Elias could see the exact moment when the salvage operator realized that his operation had just lost all legal foundation. Whatever documentation Vincent's clients possessed, it couldn't override official government authorization from the war years themselves. But Vincent Carrera hadn't built his operation on legal niceties. He had built it on the assumption that might would ultimately prevail over right, that people with sufficient resources and willingness to use violence could take what they wanted, regardless of legal technicalities. "Agent Collins," Vincent said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I think you'll find that maritime law is considerably more complex than you realize. Salvage operations in international waters operate under different jurisdictional frameworks, and my clients have invested considerable resources in preparing for this recovery. Resources that are now evidence in a federal investigation," Agent Kim replied, "along with the cache of stolen Nazi gold that you removed from Gull Island last night without proper permits or legal authorization." Vincent's expression turned cold. "I think there may have been some confusion about that incident. Maritime salvage often involves preliminary recovery operations to assess the scope and value of potential finds. Any materials recovered in that context are being held pending proper legal resolution. Materials that we'll need returned immediately," Dr. Stern said firmly, "along with any documentation your clients may possess regarding their claimed interest in these assets." The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Vincent clearly calculating his options while federal agents and Coast Guard personnel maintained their positions. The Discovery had successfully located the Meridian Grace wreck and was preparing to begin recovery operations, which meant that Vincent's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The resolution came not from negotiation, but from the arrival of additional federal vessels that had been coordinating with the recovery operation. 2 Coast Guard cutters appeared on the horizon, moving at high speed towards Cedar Bay harbor. Whatever resources Vincent had prepared for his private salvage operation, they weren't sufficient to challenge a coordinated federal response backed by international law enforcement cooperation. "This isn't over, Mr. Hartwell," Vincent said, his speedboat's engines already revving for departure. "Some people have very long memories, and they don't forget when their property is stolen from them. Neither do the families whose gold was stolen in the first place," Elias replied, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "The difference is that their claims are backed by justice, not greed." Vincent's boat disappeared into the gathering darkness, but not before Elias noticed that several of the men aboard were photographing the federal vessels and personnel. This particular battle might be over, but Vincent Carrera's organization would undoubtedly regroup and prepare for future opportunities. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the mission that had begun with Captain Blackwood's dying wish was entering its final, most crucial phase. Somewhere beneath the dark waters off Cedar Bay, the Meridian Grace waited to give up her secrets and complete a journey toward justice that had taken 80 years to reach its destination. 6 months later, on a bright October morning, when the leaves along Cedar Bay's shoreline blazed with autumn colors, Elias Hartwell stood aboard the Morning Star and watched as the final components of the floating museum were installed. The boat that had once been dismissed as a rotting hulk now served as a memorial to one of World War II's most extraordinary acts of moral courage. The museum's centerpiece was a carefully restored section of the Meridian Grace's original cabin, complete with artifacts recovered from the wreck site and detailed exhibits explaining Captain Blackwood's mission. The ship's safe, now empty but preserved as a testament to the treasure it had once contained, occupied a place of honor surrounded by photographs, documents, and personal effects that told the story of stolen gold returned to its rightful purpose. The new plaque mounted on the Morning Star's wheelhouse bore a simple inscription: "In memory of Captain Ezra Blackwood, Thomas Blackwood, and Henrik Larsen, guardians of justice, who understood that some treasures are worth more than gold." Sarah Chen, now serving as the museum's curator and historical director, emerged from the cabin where she had been arranging the final display cases. Her official title came with a substantial salary funded by the World Jewish Restitution Organization, along with resources for ongoing research into wartime recovery operations and Holocaust asset repatriation efforts. The delegation from the Goldstein Family Foundation is scheduled to arrive this afternoon, she told Elias, consulting her tablet. Anna Goldstein's great-nephew will be representing the family at the dedication ceremony. Go to... Any word from the other beneficiary organizations? All confirmed. Representatives from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the World Jewish Congress, and the International Commission on Holocaust-era insurance claims. Dr. Stern says it's the largest gathering of restitution organizations she's seen in a single location. The recovery of the Meridian Grace's cargo had yielded more than anyone had initially expected. The ship's safe had contained not just gold bars, but also jewelry, artwork, and personal effects that had been carefully catalogued and preserved by Captain Blackwood before the scuttling. Each item represented a family, a life, a story that had been stolen and was now being restored to its proper place in history. The financial value of the recovery, ultimately calculated at just over $127 million in current dollars, had been distributed according to protocols established by international Holocaust restitution agreements. The majority went to organizations providing services to Holocaust survivors and their families, with portions designated for education, remembrance, and ongoing asset recovery efforts. Elias had received a finder's fee of $500, enough to secure his financial future while allowing him to continue living in Cedar Bay. He had used part of the money to establish a foundation, providing financial assistance to families struggling with medical debt, honoring Maria's memory by helping others facing the same challenges that had nearly destroyed his life. Elias Hartwell approached from the harbor, carrying coffee for the museum staff and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that came from having his practical nature vindicated in the most impractical way possible. The brother who had initially dismissed the Morning Star purchase as foolish had become the museum's volunteer maintenance supervisor, ensuring that his brother's restored boat remained seaworthy and properly preserved. "The media trucks are starting to arrive," Marcus reported. "Tom Murphy says he's never seen so many out-of-state license plates in Cedar Bay." The story of the Morning Star and the Meridian Grace had captured international attention, generating documentaries, news articles, and academic papers that examined both the historical significance of Captain Blackwood's mission and the contemporary implications of ongoing Nazi asset recovery efforts. Cedar Bay had become an unlikely destination for historical tourism, bringing economic benefits to a town that had struggled with declining fishing revenues for decades. Father Miguel joined them on the dock, carrying a wreath that would be placed on the memorial during the afternoon ceremony. The priest had been invited to deliver the dedication prayer, recognition of his role in providing moral guidance during the investigation and his ongoing work with Holocaust remembrance organizations. "Vincent Carrera?" Elias asked. "Convicted on federal charges related to trafficking in stolen wartime assets," Miguel replied. "Sentenced to 12 years, with additional charges pending in several other jurisdictions. The network he was working for has been largely dismantled, though Dr. Stern says similar operations continue to surface, periodically. The afternoon ceremony drew nearly 1,000 people to Cedar Bay's small harbor, filling the waterfront with survivors, family members, historians, and government officials. The dedication began with Dr. Stern reading the names of Holocaust victims whose assets had been identified among the Meridian Grace's cargo, followed by Father Miguel's prayer for those who had died and those who had worked to preserve their memory. But the most moving moment came when David Goldstein, Anna Goldstein's great-nephew, stepped forward to place a photograph of his family on the museum's memorial wall. The photograph, taken in Berlin in 1938, showed Anna with her children David and Rebecca, the same image that had been found in Captain Blackwood's locket and had motivated Elias to continue the investigation despite mounting dangers. "My great-aunt Anna died in Auschwitz in 1943, David Goldstein said, his voice carrying clearly across the water. She never knew that a ship captain she had never met was carrying her photograph to the bottom of the sea, or that a fisherman she would never know would find it 80 years later and make sure it found its way home. But I think she would have understood that some promises transcend death and some acts of courage echo through generations." As the sun set over Cedar Bay that evening, Elias stood alone on the Morning Star's deck, holding his father's compass and thinking about the journey that had brought him from desperation to purpose. The compass needle pointed north, steady and true, just as it always had. But Elias no longer needed it to find his direction. Captain Blackwood's mission was complete. Henrik Larsson's vigil had ended in triumph. The gold, stolen from Holocaust victims, had found its way back to organizations working to preserve their memory and help their survivors. And in a small fishing village on the Maine coast, a rotting boat had been transformed into a monument to the principle that Captain Blackwood had died defending, that some treasures, justice, memory, the courage to do what's right are indeed worth more than gold. The Morning Star rocked gently at her mooring, her brass fittings gleaming in the harbor lights, ready to carry her message of hope and justice into whatever tomorrows lay ahead. She had chosen well, and her choice had changed everything.